You know the photograph. Children in a Berlin street building towers out of bundled banknotes because the paper is worth less than any toy it could buy. A woman feeding money into a stove because it burns longer than the firewood you could purchase with it. A wheelbarrow of cash for a loaf of bread. That is the entire popular memory of 1923, and all of it is true. It is also the least interesting thing about what happened. Because everyone knows Germany printed money. What almost nobody knows is why. And the answer is not that the government was reckless, or stupid, or trying to cheat anybody out of anything. The men who did this were experienced and well-informed. The head of the central bank had held the post since 1908. He raised interest rates to 90%, trying to stop what was happening. He defied his own government to keep his position. And he died on the precise day the currency was finally fixed. He believed he was saving the mark. So did the people around him. And the theory they were working from told them, right to the end, that they were not the cause of any of it. This story involves a single clause in a payment schedule that made the whole thing unwinnable before anybody printed anything. It involves the way Germany raised its very first reparations payment, which is where the collapse actually begins. A year in which taxes covered less than 1% of what the government spent, a central bank charging 90% interest and still, in real terms, paying people to borrow from it. And at the end, the thing everybody believes about what came next, which is wrong in a way that matters far more than the myth does. So let's go back, not to 1923, and not to the printing presses, to a room in London, in May 1921. The Treaty of Versailles had ended the war 2 years earlier. Article 231 named Germany as the aggressor. Article 232 required it to compensate the Allies for civilian damage. But Versailles did not name a number. It set an interim payment of 20 billion marks and handed the question of the total to a reparations commission, which spent 2 years arguing about it. On the 5th of May, 1921, that commission produced the London Schedule of Payments. The figure was 132 billion gold marks, roughly 33 billion US dollars at the time, and something in the region of 230% of Germany's entire pre-war annual output. Now, that number is famous, and it is also somewhat misleading, so let me be accurate about it rather than dramatic. The debt was split into 3 tranches labelled A, B and C. Germany was required to service the A and B bonds, which came to 50 billion. The C bonds, 82 billion, the majority of the headline figure, were not scheduled to begin until A and B had been cleared, which was never realistically going to happen. The historian Sally Marks argues the C bonds were essentially fictional, a number large enough to satisfy French and British publics who wanted Germany punished, attached to an obligation nobody expected to collect. For practical purposes, the bill was 50 billion, not 132. That is still an enormous sum. But hold on to the distinction, because the popular version of this story leans very heavily on the bigger number. Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson had both argued against terms this severe, on the grounds that they would destabilize Europe generally, rather than Germany specifically. They lost that argument. Here is the ledger, and it is the ledger the whole video runs on. On one side, what Germany owed. On the other, what Germany could actually generate to pay it with. Watch what happens to the 2 columns, because they do not move the way you would expect. And there is one clause in that schedule I am deliberately not telling you about yet. It is the single most important sentence in this entire story, and we will come back to it. The Reichstag accepted the terms on the 11th of May, 1921, under an ultimatum threatening occupation of the Ruhr if it refused. But it accepted for a reason that is stranger than simple submission. The Weimar government adopted what became known as the policy of fulfillment. Comply visibly, do everything asked, and thereby demonstrate to the world that the demands could not actually be met. Read that again. The strategy was to try to pay in order to prove that paying was impossible. In the summer of 1921, Germany made its first payment, 1 billion gold marks. And the way it raised that billion is where this story genuinely starts. Germany did not have 1 billion gold marks. It had paper marks, and a tax base wrecked by 4 years of war, financed almost entirely by borrowing. What it needed was foreign currency, dollars, sterling, gold, because that is what the schedule required. So the government did the only thing available to it. It sold paper marks on the international currency exchanges in enormous quantity to buy the foreign exchange it owed. Think about what that means as a mechanism. To meet an obligation denominated in hard currency, the German state became the largest seller of its own money in the world. It flooded the market with marks in order to acquire the thing marks were being measured against. In January 1922, the mark stood at roughly 493 to the dollar. A year later, it was 17,972. That is not the printing press yet. That is a government selling its currency to buy someone else's, at scale, because a treaty said it had to. Through 1922, the position deteriorated in a way that has a grim internal logic to it. As the mark fell, each payment required more marks to be sold, which pushed the mark lower, which meant the next payment required more still. The mechanism fed itself. Nobody had to do anything foolish for it to keep running. They only had to keep complying. By the autumn of 1922, Germany could no longer buy gold or foreign exchange with paper marks in any meaningful quantity. The currency simply would not purchase enough. So, reparations shifted toward payment in kind. Coal, timber, livestock, machinery, physical goods loaded onto trains and sent west. And in January 1923, Germany fell behind on those deliveries too, and was formally declared in default. Now, whether that default was genuine incapacity or calculated obstruction is one of the real disagreements in the historiography, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. The German government had, after all, adopted a policy explicitly designed to demonstrate that it could not pay. A short delivery of timber is a difficult thing to read cleanly. What is not in dispute is what France and Belgium did about it. On the 11th of January, 1923, around 60,000 French and Belgian troops crossed into the Ruhr Valley. To understand what that meant, you need to know what the Ruhr was. 2,000 square miles between the Ruhr and the Lippe rivers, and inside it, more than 80% of Germany's coal and 80% of its iron and steel. This was not a region. It was the country's ability to function. And in fairness to Poincaré, the French Prime Minister, the grievance was real. In early January 1923, Germany missed a coal delivery deadline for the 34th time in 36 months. Whatever you think of the occupation, France was not inventing a pretext. French cavalry rode into Essen on the 11th of January. The occupying forces took the factories, the mines, the steelworks and the rolling stock and disarmed the German police. 8 days later, on the 19th, the German government ordered passive resistance. Now, passive resistance is a phrase that sounds almost peaceful. What it meant in practice was that an entire population stopped working and waited to see what would be done to them. Miners refused to cut coal. Railwaymen misplaced parts, lost orders, let repairs run late. Local officials refused to obey the occupiers' instructions. France and Belgium responded by bringing in their own workers and by removing the people who wouldn't cooperate. Around 16,000 civil servants expelled from the region. Mayors marched onto trains, sent east, and barred from returning. In total, somewhere between 120 and 150,000 people were deported from the Ruhr and the near Rhineland for their part in the resistance, and it was not bloodless. On the 17th of January, 6 days in, the President of the German Parliament told the Chamber that the occupation had already taken its first life. The worst single incident came on the 31st of March at the Krupp works in Essen. A French detachment arrived to issue requisitions. The plant's management turned the workforce out against them. The detachment opened fire. 13 people were killed and around 30 injured. Krupp himself and several other executives were sentenced to 15 years. Across the whole occupation, roughly 137 civilians were killed and 600 injured. So hold the picture properly. The most productive region in Europe, deliberately idle. Coal in the ground that nobody would cut, foreign troops in the streets, neighbours put on trains, and several 100,000 families whose income had stopped in a country where the currency was already sliding in the middle of winter. That was the only lever Berlin had. And it had a cost. And the cost is the hinge of this entire story. Because if you order several 100,000 workers to stop working in the middle of a national crisis, you cannot also let them starve. The government committed to paying them. With what? Not with taxes. The tax system was already failing, and the Ruhr had just removed a substantial share of what remained of the productive economy. There was no bond market willing to lend to Germany at any rate that made sense. So the wages of the striking Ruhr workers were financed, in their entirety, by credit from the Reichsbank, which is to say, by new money, created for the purpose. And here is the figure that tells you the German state had, in a real sense, stopped functioning as a state. Between January and November of 1923, the proportion of government expenditure covered by tax revenue fell from roughly 40% to under 1%. Less than 1%. 99 pennies in every mark the government spent were being manufactured rather than collected. The Reichsbank was no longer the central bank of the German treasury. For practical purposes, it had become the German treasury. And now we come back to that clause. Because if you have been following this, expecting the story to arrive at a government printing money to escape its debts, the classic version, the one everybody tells, you are about to find out why that cannot be what happened. Go back to the London schedule, May 1921. The figure was not 132 billion marks. It was 132 billion gold marks. A unit fixed at 4 to the US dollar, written into the schedule that way for one specific reason, so that it could not be inflated away. The people who drafted that document were not naive. They had watched wartime currencies depreciate across Europe for 4 years. They knew exactly what a defeated debtor with a printing press would be tempted to do, and they closed the door before Germany could reach for it, which means Germany could print as many paper marks as it liked, and not one of them reduced the obligation by a single pfennig. Every mark created made the debt harder to service, not easier, because the debt was payable in a currency Germany had to go out and buy. Look at the ledger now. The paper column is climbing vertically off the top of the frame. The gold column has not moved since May 1921. It never moves. It was designed not to move. So the printing was never an escape from the debt. It was what trying to pay the debt looked like from the inside. Which brings us to the men in the building and to the question of what on earth they thought they were doing. The Reichsbank was run by Rudolf von Havenstein, who had been its president since and had previously run the Prussian State Bank. 30 years in public finance, not a crank. And the Reichsbank was, by this point, formally independent. The autonomy law of May 1922 had cut the government's control over it and installed Havenstein effectively for life. That detail becomes important shortly. Havenstein and his board held to a doctrine, a real one with a taught in universities, called the real bills doctrine. It says, roughly, that money a central bank creates to finance genuine productive activity cannot be inflationary. Because the new money arrives alongside new goods, the two are matched, and no artificial purchasing power has been created. Lend against real commerce, and you are not inflating, you are lubricating. Underneath that sat a second belief, and this one is the fatal one. The Reichsbank held that the mark was falling for reasons entirely outside Germany. Reparations, the balance of payments, foreign speculation against the currency. That external fall pushed up domestic prices. Higher prices meant businesses and workers needed more currency to transact. And the Reichsbank's job, as it understood the job, was to meet that demand, to supply the money the economy was asking for. Cause and effect, precisely reversed. The economist James Tobin later described it as post hoc ergo propter hoc, running backwards. Picture a doctor at a bedside. His patient is burning with fever and shivering violently. The doctor sees the shivering, concludes the man is cold, and puts a blanket on him. An hour later, the patient is worse and shivering harder. So the doctor adds another blanket, and another. Every observation confirms the diagnosis. The patient does look cold. The blankets are the obvious kindness. The doctor is attentive, experienced, and entirely wrong, and the more carefully he does his job, the faster the man dies. That is the Reichsbank. In 1923, prices rise, so the economy needs more currency, so the bank supplies it, so prices rise. Every turn of the loop produced evidence that the bank read as proof it was doing the right thing. In that model, the Reichsbank is not the cause of the inflation, it is the response to it. And you can see why nobody inside the building could easily disprove it. Prices really were rising. Businesses really were short of currency. The mark really was under external pressure from an obligation Germany really could not meet. Every observable fact was consistent with the theory. The theory was simply pointing the arrow the wrong way. Here is Havenstein in his own words, in a speech to the Reichsbank's Central Committee in August 1923. Prices at that point were rising roughly 20-fold in a single month. He told the committee that it was not disputed that central bank credit increased the quantity of paper in circulation, but that to the extent the bank was granting economically desirable and necessary credits that assisted production and the movement of goods, it was not creating artificial purchasing power. That is quoted from Harold James's work, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. In August 1923, with the currency visibly disintegrating in the hands of everyone in the country, the president of the central bank was explaining to his own committee that what the bank was doing did not count as inflation. He was not lying to them. This is a man restating a professional consensus he had held for his entire career, at the precise moment it was being falsified outside his window. And I want to be fair to him, because there is a detail that everybody skips. He was not doing nothing. In April 1923, Havenstein raised the discount rate to 18%. In September, he raised it to 90%. That is not the act of a man who thinks inflation is imaginary. But by September, prices were doubling roughly every 2 days. Put those two numbers next to each other, because that is the whole thing. 90% was the interest for a year. Prices doubled every 2 days. A full year of the Reichsbank's most punitive rate in its history cost a borrower less than 2 days of inflation. So here is the trade, and half of German industry was running it. On Monday morning, you borrow 1,000,000 marks from the Reichsbank. You do not buy machinery because machinery takes time. You walk out and spend the entire million that day on anything physical. Coal, steel, cloth, dollars, shares in a company that owns a building. Then you wait a month. In that month, prices multiply by roughly 30,000. You sell a small fraction of what you bought, a few percent of it, and you repay the bank the million you borrowed, plus a month's interest, which comes to about 75,000 marks. By then, that is not a debt. It is a rounding error. Everything else you keep. That is what a negative real interest rate of that magnitude does. The Reichsbank was not restraining anybody. It was handing out loans that repaid themselves to people who used them to buy up the real assets of a country whose savers were being wiped out. The central bank was financing the stripping of Germany and charging what looked like a brutal rate of interest while it did it. This is what a wrong model does. It doesn't stop you acting. It makes every action you take an accelerant. The end came quickly and from outside the Reichsbank. Montagu Norman, governor of the Bank of England, had been openly critical of Havenstein's policy and supported replacing him. The German government wanted him gone too. But the autonomy law they had passed the previous year meant they could not remove him, and he refused to go. So they went around him. Hjalmar Schacht, a critic of the Reichsbank's policy, was given a parallel post as Reich Currency Commissioner, with authority over a new currency. In the autumn, Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor, ended passive resistance in the Ruhr, and backed the reform. The Rentenmark was introduced in November 1923. The mechanics of why it worked are a video of their own. But the essential thing was a hard cap. A fixed quantity, no discretion to expand, and a public commitment that the government would not fund itself from it. It worked almost immediately. The existing government debt, around 150,000 million marks, resolved to roughly 15 pfennigs in the new currency. An entire national debt extinguished by arithmetic. On the 20th of November, 1923, as the stabilization took hold, Rudolf von Havenstein died of a heart attack. He had presided over the German central bank for 15 years. He never accepted that the institution he ran was the cause, and he did not live a full day past the moment somebody else proved it was. Now, there is one more part of this, and it is the part almost every account of 1923 gets wrong. You have heard the claim, the hyperinflation destroyed Germany, and out of that destruction came Hitler. It is repeated constantly, and there is a version of it that is true, but the usual version is not. Look at the dates. The beer hall putsch, Hitler's attempt to seize power in Munich, happened in November 1923, the same month as the stabilization. It failed. Comprehensively. He went to prison. And then, as the Rentenmark held and the Dawes Plan restructured the reparations in 1924, and the German economy recovered, the Nazi vote did not grow. It collapsed. By the 1928 federal election, the party was polling under 3%. 3%. 5 years after the wheelbarrows. In an electorate that had lived through all of it, they were a fringe irrelevance. The breakthrough came in 1930, and then in 1932, under the exact opposite economic condition. Not inflation, deflation. Not a currency collapsing, but a currency being defended, with austerity, wage cuts, and mass unemployment during the Depression. So if you want a monetary explanation for 1933, the honest one points at Chancellor Brüning's deflation, not at Havenstein's inflation. But here is the part that should genuinely trouble you, and it is why 1923 is not irrelevant at all. Think about who the hyperinflation destroyed. Not the industrialists. Many of them did extremely well, borrowing in marks and repaying in nothing. Not people who held land or machinery or foreign currency or debt. Real things survived. Real debts evaporated. What was annihilated was every fixed claim denominated in marks. Savings accounts, pensions, insurance policies, war bonds bought out of patriotism, which is to say, the assets of the cautious, the prudent, and the old. The people who had done exactly what they were told to do. Those people were not made poor by the Depression. They were made poor in 1923, and they were still poor when the Depression arrived 7 years later, with no savings left to absorb it, and no particular reason to feel loyal to a republic that had already taken everything once. The hyperinflation did not elect anybody. What it did was remove the people who would have had something to lose. I want to be careful before I finish, because this story gets used for things it does not support. This is not evidence that paper money always ends this way. Germany's problem was extremely specific. An external obligation, denominated in a unit it could not print, that it could not restructure and could not default on without invasion, combined with a central bank running a theory that told it the arrow pointed the other way. And the underlying question is genuinely unsettled. Keynes argued Germany could never have paid the reparations and avoided catastrophe. Sally Marx and, more recently, Alessandro Rosselli argue the opposite, that actual payments were a small fraction of the headline, that the C bonds were never real, and that Germany's fiscal choices were choices. Serious historians hold both positions. I lean toward the structural reading, but not with confidence. What is not seriously disputed is the narrower claim this video is making. The fiscal disaster was not the Reichsbank's creation, but the Reichsbank's attachment to a doctrine that could not see its own effect is what turned a very bad inflation into one of the worst monetary collapses in recorded history. Germany's money was not destroyed by men who didn't care about it. It was destroyed by the effort to keep a promise written in a currency Germany could not make. And the thing worth taking from it is not about paper, or gold, or any particular monetary arrangement. It is that Havenstein had 30 years of experience, a coherent theory, and every observable fact in front of him arranged neatly in support of it. He was not a fool, and he was not corrupt. He was working from a model that pointed one arrow in the wrong direction, and every single competent, diligent, well-intentioned thing he did after that made the disaster worse. If that changed how you think about 1923, subscribe. This is Broken Promises, a series that takes the events everybody thinks they understand and follows the money underneath them. And I want your answer to a real disagreement. Could Germany have paid the reparations and avoided the collapse? Keynes said no. The burden was structurally impossible, and everything that followed was the consequence. Marx and Rosselli say yes. The real obligation was a third of the famous number. Actual payments were smaller still, and what happened was the result of German choices. Different stories, different responsibility, and historians still argue about it. Tell me where you land and why. I read them. Next time on Broken Promises, 150 years earlier, another government sent a bill to people who had not agreed to it. Everyone remembers what happened as a protest against a tax on tea. There was no new tax, and the tea the colonists destroyed was the cheapest tea anyone in America had ever been offered. That one's next.